Welcome and thank you for joining us for the current state of waste and race in North Carolina. My name is Ryan Nilsson. I work at the Carolina Center for Public Service at UNC Chapel Hill, and I have a few words of introduction to make before passing it off to our presenter for the session, Professor Courtney Woods. This event is part of Carolina Engagement Week, which is a week-long celebration of public engagement that features events, workshops, stories, and other experiences that highlight collaborations between UNC Chapel Hill and community partners across North Carolina. The session is also part of a multi-college collaboration spotlighting changemakers across the country who are driving justice and equity forward, called Journeys Toward Justice. We will post links in the chat, which you can follow for more information about both of these series. I will note that we had so much interest in this event, with over 180 people registered as of last night, that we decided to switch from the Zoom meeting format we'd initially planned to a Zoom webinar. While this may be less interactive than it would have been with a smaller group, we invite you to please feel free to engage with one another in the chat throughout the presentation. Please do submit questions that you would like to be answered through the Q&A feature, and we will try to dedicate some time toward the end of the session to those questions. Closed captioning is available by clicking on the closed caption icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will be recording the session and sharing it with those registered after the event. If you are a UNC student hoping to receive a campus life experience credit through your participation in the event, please watch the chat for a link we will share toward the end of the event through which you will log your attendance. You will not receive credit if you do not follow the link and mark your attendance. Now, Courtney Woods is an associate professor of environmental sciences and engineering at the Gillings School of Global Public Health at UNC Chapel Hill. As an environmental health scientist, she employs community-driven, mixed methods approaches to study water quality, access to public water infrastructure, and risk perception in rural communities. This year, she's been collaborating with researchers at RTI to further her research on community and water quality impacts of landfills. Much of this work has been focused in Sampson County, North Carolina, and she'll discuss some of it today. Courtney also leads the Environmental Justice Action Research Clinic, or EJ Clinic, at UNC, which provides research and technical assistance to communities facing existing and imminent environmental threats. I will say that I know Courtney most directly through her excellent mentorship and partnership and participatory research methods of the many graduate and professional students doing EJ work who participate in our year-long community engagement fellowship at the Carolina Center for Public Service. And I appreciate the investment she's making not only in her own work with communities like those in Sampson County, but also in other researchers' capacity to do similarly meaningful, engaged work throughout our state. Lastly, it's worth mentioning that Courtney is a founding member of the Earthseed Land Collective based in Durham. Earthseed's mission is to remember and reimagine our relationship to ourselves, each other, and the land in the practice of collective liberation. And now I will turn it over to Courtney to share with us a little bit about her work and the current state of waste and race in North Carolina. Thanks for being with us, Courtney.
Thank you for the introduction, Ryan. And I want to thank you all for joining. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been engaged in Sampson County, and offer a little bit of insight into some of the history of environmental racism and environmental justice in North Carolina, and how that movement was centered on where we decide to place our waste around the country. Before I jump into my talk, I do want to offer some acknowledgements of the wonderful folks that I get a chance to work with here at UNC and EJ Clinic. I also have the great privilege of collaborating with folks in Sampson County that work with the Environmental Justice Community Action Network, EJ CAN. We're collaborating with them along with faculty and students at Appalachian State University to understand residents' concerns around water quality. And and understand how both landfills and other facilities in that county may impact water quality. And then this year I've had the privilege of collaborating with folks at RTI as well on research that's centered on landfills. Lastly, I'll note that my involvement in environmental justice work in North Carolina started by my meeting Ms. Naima Muhammad during a luncheon many years ago, and I owe her deep gratitude for my understanding of community issues around environmental hazards in the state. And I owe a deep debt of gratitude to Mr. Ellis Tatum as well for inviting me to collaborate with his community. He's a resident of Sampson County and an EJ advocate there. All right, so most of you all don't spend a lot of time thinking about your trash, and I want to offer us an opportunity to spend a little bit of time and get some little bit of in-depth understanding of what our waste is and where it goes. I thought I'd start by just offering a description of the different types of solid waste, and note that most of the waste that you're disposing of in your homes would include food waste and rubbish. So that may be paper or cardboard or textiles. There are other types of waste that may be produced at industrial facilities. For example, ash and residues may be produced at power plants or incinerators. Construction and demolition waste is another major source of waste in the state around the country. And that results from any building materials. And then there are a series of other streams of waste, special waste, which can be disposed of in along with food waste and rubbish in what we refer to as municipal solid waste landfills. And then these other streams of waste, treatment plant waste or hazardous waste, typically have their own sort of designation and sites for disposal. So the stuff that we throw away, where does it go? Most of the way that we manage municipal solid waste in North Carolina is via landfilling. So we have lots of land compared to maybe smaller states, or if we think, of countries, for example, like a Japan, because we have lots of waste, we tend to, because we have lots of land, we tend to prefer landfilling as opposed to incinerating. There are federal regulations in terms of how we manage or dispose of our solid waste. And the first federal laws that came about for solid waste disposal were through the Solid Waste Disposal Act in 1964. And that law essentially acknowledged that as our country is becoming more industrialized, and as consumers are needing to dispose of all of the things that we're using and then no longer using, that we needed some regulations around how those materials are disposed of and stored. Around 1976, RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, was formulated to just offer more details and more guidelines around how waste is disposed of. And this particular law enumerated that hazardous waste should be disposed of in certain facilities, and non-hazardous or municipal solid waste construction and demolition waste, waste that was not perceived as hazardous, needed to be managed in another way. This law, RCRA, also essentially described the authority by the state to permit landfills, and described some requirements around those state permits, as well as criteria for solid waste landfills. So if we think about landfills, in particular municipal solid waste landfills, prior to the RCRA regulations, you might imagine just a hole in the ground. There are lots of what we refer to as pre-regulatory landfills. Many of these are just dumps that don't have any sort of separation or barrier between the waste and the ground where you're sort of digging the hole. And obviously this results in a pretty significant potential threat to groundwater, as there's nothing that would prevent water that percolates through the landfill from entering into groundwater, and then potentially harming wells that folks are relying on groundwater for use. So RCRA established some regulations around how landfills should be constructed. It designates that there should be either some sort of clay liner or plastic liner that serves as a barrier between the waste and the hole that you've dug. It also establishes some requirements around monitoring of groundwater and surface water near those landfills. And so the second image here shows some of the sort of monitoring wells for water, as well as gas, since we know that landfills produce methane. So they're wells for monitoring gas as well. One thing to note while I'm on this slide is that while the RCRA regulations essentially require that municipal solid waste landfills be, they require this sort of protective lining. Construction and demolition landfills, which again, this is any sort of materials from buildings or wood that you may dispose of. Those facilities or those landfills do not require any sort of lining. So as a public health professional and environmental health professional and researcher, I'm really interested in understanding what the environmental and human health impacts of landfills are. There are over 1,000 landfills, thousands of landfills across the country. We have about 600 pre-regulatory landfills and another 500 or so municipal and solid waste and construction and demolition landfills in North Carolina. And so there are a range of environmental and health impacts that could occur as a result of landfill leachate, which again is the water that percolates through, or the precipitation that would percolate through a landfill. So if that were to enter into groundwater, that's one potential source of contamination of groundwater and wells that people are using. There are also a range of air emissions that could occur at landfills. Methane, as we'll see in a minute, is which also is referred to as landfill gas, is released as a result of decomposition of materials in landfills. And so those both pose potential public health threats for any residents or workers that may be near landfills. There are also a range of nuisances that have been reported in literature. So odors that may emanate from, again, the decomposing materials in landfills, as well as the landfill gas. For large landfills, like the one that I'll be talking about today, there are hundreds of trucks that come through. Some of those may be coming through on secondary and neighborhood roads. And those pose both a sort of nuisance to rural quality of life if the landfill is in a rural area. It also may pose as a source of exposure to air emissions and air pollutants. There's also noise that's associated with the traffic as well as the operations of the landfill. And then as a result of speaking to residents who are neighboring these facilities, we might not think of animals that come to landfills to feed as a potential nuisance, but turkey vultures is one that's commonly reported by residents. So what's potentially in the leachate, this again, the water that's coming through the landfills. Leachate can contain microbial contaminants. It can contain heavy metals as a result of the contents of the landfill, polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, PFAS, which we know in North Carolina is a hot topic right now with lots of consumer products that contain PFAS that are disposed of in landfills. We know that landfills are a common source of potential migration of these contaminants into surrounding environments. Landfill gas, as I mentioned before, is released and at many landfills across the country also collected. So they're what we refer to as waste to energy projects, where the landfill gas is captured and then used, typically used on site for energy production. And then a range of volatile organics and ammonia and sulfides, which are some of the odorant pollutants. We might not think of landfills when we're worried about and talking about climate issues, but landfills do serve as an important source of methane in particular. This data is from the US EPA from 1990 to 2019, and they're citing that municipal solid waste landfills serve as about 15% of the methane emissions across the country. And so, exposure to all of these contaminants or pollutants can result in health impacts in residents or workers who are exposed. I'm citing one systematic review here, but there are a range of other health studies, many demonstrating health impacts and others, sort of showing that there's the results are inconclusive. In most cases, the studies really aren't sort of large enough, at least the ones that are cited here, where they demonstrate inadequate evidence for health impacts from landfills. They do cite that some of these studies are just not large enough to assess impact. But there are some that they cited that demonstrated limited evidence for respiratory disease and respiratory symptoms, as well as low birth weight and some other birth and reproductive disorders. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears a bit and move from talking about landfills, contaminants, and potential health impacts to thinking about what happens when a community is cited to be a host of a landfill. Hopefully, as if you're a resident of North Carolina, you are aware of the struggles in Afton or Warren County, North Carolina, in the early 80s. So this is considered the birthplace of the environmental justice movement. At that time, about 100 million pounds of PCB contaminated soil was proposed to be sent to a landfill, or a landfill was proposed to be constructed in Warren County. This PCB contaminated soil would be disposed of there. Afton was a majority African-American town, and so many of the residents and other local leaders protested. They protested for many months. Also during this time, the term environmental racism was coined by Reverend Ben Chavis, who is also a leader nationally and brought quite a bit of attention to the issue. Despite the protest of residents and others around the country, the Warren County was cited for the landfill and hosted it for several years. They eventually sort of remediated or dug up the contaminants in 2000s and moved it elsewhere. And there was evidence that that landfill did leak. And so residents there now are concerned about what potential health impacts and exposure might have occurred during those several decades that they hosted the landfill. Concurrent to what was happening in Warren County, North Carolina, there was also a similar struggle happening in Houston, Texas. So a case, Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management, was being tried in, this was in the late 70s. And the case demonstrated or argued that African-American residents were being disproportionately impacted by the city's waste. 5 of the city's 5 landfills, or all of the landfills, were sited in Black communities. The public landfills and 3 of the 4 privately owned landfills were sited in majority Black communities, when African Americans or Black folks only comprised 25% of the city's population. The city didn't have any sort of zoning at that time. And so, the folks who were making decisions around where waste was sited were essentially the city council people. And there wasn't representation of Black folks in that council. So what was happening in North Carolina and in Texas sort of spurred a broader national assessment on where waste facilities were sited, and some assessment of race and wealth. In 1983, the General Accounting Office conducted a study to determine if there was any correlation between the location of hazardous waste landfills and racial or economic status of surrounding communities. And they conducted their assessment around essentially 4 landfills that were in Region 4. So this is the southeastern part of the U.S. And what they did demonstrate was that that a majority of those facilities were sited in areas where Black residents were in the majority or in a higher proportion of the population compared to areas that did not host those landfills. There was also another study conducted by the United Church of Christ, and this was instead of sort of focusing in a multi-state region, they actually conducted a nationwide study and found that race was the most significant factor in determining where a waste treatment, storage, or disposal facility was located in the U.S. This study looked at zip codes, and they compared host zip codes to non-host zip codes, and found that that for areas that had no waste treatment, storage, or disposal facility, there was about a 12% minority population. When they looked at areas that were hosting at least one facility, the percent of people of color increased twofold. And then when they looked at areas that were hosting more than one or hosting some of the largest landfills in the country, it tripled. There were some critiques of this study, and one of the major critiques was based on the sort of spatiality or spatial range that they used for the assessment. And so the previous study essentially looked at the zip code, and I think another one looked at census tract, and didn't make any distinction between proximity to the facility. So they just essentially said, if they compared host tracts or host zip codes to non-host zip codes or non-host tracts. And so a study later conducted by Mohia and Saha in 2007 suggested that this approach, a sort of unit hazard coincidence approach, doesn't account for exposure or impacts on folks who might be in a different census tract or might be in a different zip code, but are actually closer to the facility than folks who are in the census tract or in the zip code. So this image here kind of shows a facility that's on the border. So it would have potential impacts on residents who are on the other side and not considered in that host region. Their study also found that, in fact, 49%, so almost half of waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities are within a quarter mile of a boundary, whether it's a county boundary or census tract boundary. And then another 71% were within a mile. So their study, they actually employed a proximity, sort of distance-based approach in which they looked within a 3-kilometer range of the facility, and that particular distance is associated with the distance at which some studies have shown potential health impacts. Their study certainly corroborated what was found in the United Church of Christ study and the GAO study. In fact, suggests that there were even higher numbers of people of color impacted. So they demonstrated higher proportion of folks of color impacted in those regions. So those were had a sort of national or at least regional focus in the US. I'm going to bring us now to North Carolina and talk a little bit about what's been studied in terms of race and wealth in North Carolina. I should note in the previous studies that they looked at both race and at least the Mohia and Saha study also looked at class and found some correlations as well with increasing class, or excuse me, lower income and lower class and proximity to waste facilities. In North Carolina, the story is very similar. So this study was conducted here at UNC by folks in epidemiology, and they looked at block groups, so a smaller spatial range, and showed that as race, the proportion of people of color increased, they saw an increase in the likelihood of that block group having at least one solid waste facility, and that they sort of observed a sort of dose response increase from 0 to 10% people of color to 10 to 30% people of color up to 30% and higher. And they demonstrated or observed a similar trend when they looked at household income. So as household income, house value decreased, they also saw an increase in the likelihood of a waste facility being cited there. The timing of this study is really important. So it came out in 2007. This coincided with a really important legislative action that was occurring in North Carolina. And that was transformation, significant changes to the Solid Waste Management Act. So it's the state law. One of the most significant pieces of this law, so I'll note that this law involved limiting or prohibiting the generation of new landfills, though expansions can still occur. It did stop further new landfills from being developed or constructed. And this was largely because North Carolina was slated to be one of the largest largest landfill states in the country. So, we already had quite a few landfills, but the sort of proliferation of new landfills was expected to increase had this law not been established. The law also made a very important requirement that the commissions that are approving permits for solid waste facilities, that they basically deny a permit if there's evidence that there may be a disproportionate impact on minority communities or low-income communities. So this is the only law that sort of regulates environmental, if we're thinking about, for example, laws that are associated with air permits or water permits. This is the only one in North Carolina that allows for a permit to be denied if there's this demonstration of disproportionate impact. And this will be important later as we move through the discussion. So I want to know that I mentioned before, there are lots of landfills across the state. The size and both the sort of area of those landfills and the amount of waste that's disposed of in them vary across the state. I'm noting that there are 42 active municipal solid waste landfills, 57 active construction and demolition landfills, and then there are over 600 pre-regulatory landfills. Again, these are landfills that were produced before the RCRA regulations. And so majority of these landfills are not lined. I would argue that none of those landfills are lined. And so there's certainly threat to groundwater. Many of those are not, there have been assessments of drinking water near many of those landfills. And there's also been some assessment of sensitive receptors like daycares and schools and churches, and some evidence that most of those landfills are within a quarter mile of a sensitive receptor. So my understanding is that DEQ has a pre-regulatory landfill program, and they're doing quite a bit of work to understand what some of the water quality impacts and other impacts of those landfills are, and are working to remediate many of them and find other ways to manage the others. So to talk about a specific landfill, two specific landfills in North Carolina that have both been have garnered attention around the state, have garnered widespread advocacy and organizing by residents who live nearby, are the Orange County landfill and the Sampson County landfill. So the Orange County landfill was established in the 70s. For folks who are in Chapel Hill, if you're familiar with Rogers Road, the landfill is just a couple miles down that from the intersection of Rogers Road and Martin Luther King. That landfill was a municipal solid waste landfill. Orange County, including UNC Chapel Hill, sent their waste there. That community is largely African American. Many of the leaders protested the landfill and eventually ended up agreeing to host the landfill in exchange for many community benefits, including sidewalks and connection to sewerage and water infrastructure. After years of hosting this landfill, many of those promises were not implemented, and only recently, within the last 10 years, has the landfill been closed, and some of the infrastructure that was promised has been finally implemented. I think there may still be some homes that are not connected to water, but there have been some efforts there to get the remaining residents connected to public water and sewerage infrastructure. Once that landfill closed, and I should note that the Rogers Eubanks Neighborhood Association, RENA, the leaders there have been instrumental in organizing and bringing more attention to this issue. Once the landfill closed, Orange County, I think, began sending their waste to the Durham Transfer Station, and waste from the Durham Transfer Station is sent several hundred, maybe 90 plus miles down east to Sampson County. Sampson County is one of the largest counties area-wise in the state. They're quite racially diverse and are home to the Kohari tribe. They are ranked 12 in the state in terms of folks who are living below the poverty line or who are uninsured. So there are certainly some social vulnerabilities there, and they host many other major hazards, including confined animal feeding operations. So they rank in the top of the state for pork production as well as poultry production. Despite that, of course, they have a rich history. I mentioned the Kohari tribe who are there. There are many notable African Americans, such as John Merrick, who was a resident or born there. And they have a a rich history of rural life. So the Sampson County landfill has been there since the 80s, I think early 80s. Similar to the Orange County, this landfill is located in a predominantly African-American community. I think compared to the state, the proportion of African-Americans within the block group are 44% compared to, I believe, 20% or 27% in the state. So some disproportionate impacts on African Americans there. I note that it's the largest in terms of amount of waste that's sent there. So they receive up to 5,000 tons per day. That equates to 250 trucks that are delivering waste there every day of the week except Sunday. And the landfill spans 1,300 acres. The Sampson County facility includes a pre-regulatory landfill or pre-regulatory site, as well as a municipal solid waste landfill, an active municipal solid waste landfill, and an active construction and demolition landfill. So they have both the sort of lined landfill that's collecting leachate, and the leachate is sent to wastewater treatment plant. But they do also have sections of the landfill that are unlined, and don't have the same sort of leachate collection and monitoring, groundwater monitoring. So we were really interested in collaborating and learning more about what residents' concerns are near that landfill after hearing from a resident who grew up in near the neighborhood and has great memories of his family and raised concerns about both environmental impacts as well as potential health impacts. We learned about the concerns at the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network annual summit. So to better understand, what some of the potential concerns were, we started off with a qualitative assessment, and we used a technique known as photo voice, which allows for research volunteers to sort of center the discussion around photos. And they take the photos and then they choose which photos they want to center the discussion around. The approach is considered a sort of community engaged or community-based participatory approach in that it aims to walk research volunteers through a process by which they're assessing, what they see in the image, what's happening in the image, and how can they change what's happening if they are deem it's a problem. Usually these sessions are centered around something that residents or research volunteers are aiming to change or aiming to better understand. So our sessions centered around health-related quality of life and environmental concerns based on what we'd heard from Mr. Ellis Tatum at the NCEJN Summit. We conducted an initial meeting and then followed that with 3 photo voice sessions. These sessions, we think of this as a sort of case study in the sense that the findings from this aren't considered to be generalizable to a broad audience. They do sort of represent what's happening in a particular region, but they may offer some insights that would be useful for other communities that are similarly impacted. So we recorded and transcribed the sessions, and similar to other qualitative techniques, we had some themes that we developed before conducting the study based on our research questions, and then other themes that emerged during the discussions. And then we had at least 2 people who reviewed the codes and made some came to some consensus or agreement around the codes and applying them to particular themes. I'll summarize this quickly, just to make sure we have some time for questions. So some of the primary codes that came up were associated with residents wanting to take action, residents being really concerned about landfill expansion based on some of the infrastructure that they were seeing in place near the landfill. Residents also expressed health concerns, and several expressed concerns around water quality, as well as water quantity. And this is an image, one of the what they refer to as trigger images that was used for discussion. And this image, as you can see, has a picture of turkey vultures roosting on a resident's home, and they live just across from the landfill. I pulled out some quotes that were associated with water quality and water quantity and water testing, as this is what drove some of our subsequent environmental monitoring that's currently ongoing. Residents talked about having to dig deeper wells because they would recognize that they didn't have any water. The residents who are closest to the landfill actually were eventually connected to county water, but there's still many residents nearby who are on wells. So concerns about digging deeper wells for if wells are contaminated, and then other concerns around the cost of accessing good water, whether that's having to dig a deeper well or having to treat water in their well, or having to buy bottled water, which many residents in that area do. So this study encouraged us to further examine water quality. We started by looking at surface water, just to understand if the landfill is a potential source of contaminants leaching into or migrating into the environment. I'm not going to show all the results here, but I'll summarize by saying that we measured water in a stream that's just on the backside of the landfill, and we took samples up gradient as well as down gradient of the landfill, as well as proximal to the landfill. And given that this landfill also was the recipient of some of the sludge from industrial production of PFAS, or perfluoroalkyl substances, we were interested in measuring some common landfill contaminants as well as PFAS. And we measured both the PFAS compounds that we might expect to see from disposal of, regular everyday consumer products like pizza boxes and food wrappers, as well as some of these novel contaminant or novel PFAS that would just be associated with the industrial production. What we did find, I don't include the graphs here, but this work is published in Leah Walsh's thesis, is that sites that were up gradient of the landfill had essentially negligible, if any, levels of legacy and novel PFAS, and sites that we collected water from adjacent to the landfill or downstream, downgradient of the landfill had much higher levels. The cumulative levels were higher than the 140 parts per trillion that at the time were the sort of water, drinking water standard. Of course, this is not drinking water, it's surface water, but we did measure cumulative levels higher than that, that drinking water standard. I'm going to skip along through these quickly, but I do just want to note that we are doing additional work there to just look at sort of publicly available data. So looking at race, so the block, these are blocks, not block groups, I believe, that are colored based on, or shaded based on the proportion of people of color. So we're interested in seeing if there's any correlation between race and proximity to hazards, as well as proximity to infrastructure. So this is just a visual depiction of some of that work, and we're in the process of conducting some more statistical analysis on those. And then just to note, so moving from measuring surface water, we are collaborating now with EJCAN and Appalachian State to assess people's tap water or well water. We're again measuring for PFAS, heavy metals, and fecal bacteria. And some of this work was initiated before I joined the team. So Appalachian State's done some amazing work to measure metals, and our team is focusing on PFAS and fecal coliform. So far, we have identified some homes that have both concerning levels of fecal coliform, as well as concerning levels of PFAS and metals. And we're doing more work now to sort of determine how those levels correlate with proximity to the landfill and other environmental hazards in that area. So this, for me, highlights two examples of Black communities that, even in absence, I'll say, of definitive environmental monitoring data for water or air quality, we do have stories that we've collected systematically through our photo voice method, as well as additional qualitative work that's being done to demonstrate that this landfill in particular in Sampson County is having an adverse impact on residents' quality of life, and that the concern for potential expansion is one that we could potentially remediate by a range of actions, which I'll offer in a second. I want to close by just noting that, these are the Orange County landfill, Sampson County landfill are two case examples. There are other both hazardous waste landfills and dump sites that have also across the state that have also been shown to be present in communities of color. Baden Works is another example in Stanley County of predominantly Black communities that have noted sort of informal dump sites that need to be remediated, and understanding what some of the environmental and potential health impacts are of interest to the residents. And that despite the Solid Waste Act's requirement that at least, landfill expansions, or there won't be new permits, but any sort of expansion project should consider potential disproportionate impacts on communities of color and low-income communities. But that apparently doesn't cover, an existing landfill and the whatever plans there are for sending waste to that landfill. And so I highlight another case in which waste from one Black community is proposed to be sent to another Black community. Lisa Sorg from North Carolina Policy Watch reported on this in August of 2022. So Navassa, which is also in the eastern part of the state, hosted a facility, a Kerr-McGee facility that applied creosote, which is sort of transforms into a range of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. So they apply creosote to utility poles so that they don't rot. And after many years of operating, about 40 years of operating in that area, the facility essentially, spun off to another company and declared bankruptcy, leaving behind, several thousand cubic yards of contaminated waste. The recent considerations for remediating or moving that waste included moving it from Navassa to the Sampson County landfill. And so while Sampson County is currently hosting a landfill, this consideration for, not creating additional burden by presenting more hazardous material. They determined that it was not hazardous, but potentially hazardous material into a community that's already impacted. The Solid Waste Act doesn't account for that, nor does it account for example, the industrial sludge that was sent there for many decades. So I want to highlight, want to open up for questions, but before that, I do want to highlight that there's certainly a lot of research that could be done to understand what potential impacts around the state are occurring in communities of color. Our work has centered on one and sort of drawn connections between other Black communities that are connected based on the sort of waste transfers that occur between Black communities. There's still certainly space for more sort of spatial analysis to understand how across the state where our storage, disposal, and treatment facilities cited. And I think since 2007, there hasn't been any systematic assessment of that. Our group is focused on, we're really interested in understanding, if there's any racially disparate impact of pre-regulatory sites, pre-regulatory landfills, as well as construction and demolition landfills, given that those aren't lined and many are sited in rural areas where residents are relying very heavily on private wells. So more research, obviously, and then, applying not just race, but also looking at historical indicators of racism or oppression, I think are important. I think we certainly should be encouraging both legislative and executive action on that can enhance public participation and data availability and public health considerations and cumulative impacts on the sort of burden that communities might already be experiencing from hosting facilities. That we need more. We need more laws and action that can create, I guess, stricter processes for permitting. I also didn't mention monitoring, so that's another area where we could see some improvements. There are requirements for landfills to essentially monitor at those monitoring wells twice a year. But there are lots of contaminants, potential contaminants that are not monitored during those events. And, our group is really interested in PFAS. PFAS are a class of compounds that aren't required to be monitored, among many others. So some improvements in what's required to be monitored, I think, would be another place for improvement. And then finally, I hate to turn it on us as consumers, but we certainly have some say in this matter by what we purchase. I think we can both change our own consumer practices and also encourage the folks that we're buying things from to change the way that they're producing those products, to reduce packaging, so that we're not, throwing away lots of materials into these landfills. With that, I will stop share and offer folks to.
Yeah. Thank you, Courtney. So we have about 7 questions submitted in the chat already to cover in the next 15 minutes. And I invite folks to upvote or like the questions that you want us to prioritize in case we don't get to all of them. So I'll ask the first question from Rania Masri. What about private landfills and the lack of required regulation and thus no reporting of private landfills? Do we know their number?
Yeah, I mean, private landfills still, they fall under the RCRA requirements. They are required to, practice the lining and leachate collection. And so they are required to comply with the regulations. We also do know where they are. So the state does report on where they are and publish their monitoring data, which I think, may be different from some other facilities. And I think my understanding is that there's not necessarily a lack of transparency from in looking at private versus publicly managed landfills.
Thanks. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Have there been any recent lawsuits regarding water quality and quantity? What legal routes can residents take?
That's a great question. I am not aware of any lawsuits in North Carolina. I'm not aware of any recent lawsuits in North Carolina. I am also not a lawyer. I would probably default to some of my colleagues at SCLC and some of the other organizations that do a lot of environmental law work. I will say that there is the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which again sort of requires that the state or any entity that's receiving federal funds cannot discriminate by race. And so if we've seen this applied, for example, in hog waste as one example, where residents argue that by continuing to administer permit or renew permits to an industry that has demonstrated disproportionate impact on communities of color, then that is a form of discrimination. And the state Department of Environmental Quality receives federal funds from the EPA. So I've seen that applied, that sort of legal pool applied in the case of CAFOs. I'm not aware of any current or pending lawsuits, either civil or civil, Title VI for landfills.
Thanks. This question is from George Stubbs. Is the Sampson County landfill's 50-year lifespan a regulatory designation? What must happen after those 50 years?
Good question. It's not, I think it's just based on the capacity. I anticipate that there's, possibility for expansion. This is often what happens when a landfill is, reaching their capacity. I was just reading an article from Fayetteville where they, are concerned about capacity of the landfill and are proposing to buy adjacent land so that they can essentially expand. It won't be considered a new landfill, but that they can expand and then have increased capacity. But generally, I've seen that across the nation, there, I think on average, Sampson County, I indicated 50-year lifespan, but I think the average around the country is somewhere around 20. So we're, yes, throwing away lots of stuff, and I think need to come up with some really innovative alternatives, both for reducing the amount of materials that we're disposing of. Yeah, I mean, that's I would say one of my primary solutions.
Thanks. This question is from Maritza Mendoza. Do you see community benefits agreements being a useful strategy in ensuring communities near landfills or other solid waste management facilities actually get to decide how these facilities are managed? What testing or monitoring needs to be required, or what measures need to be put in place to not further marginalize people living nearby?
Thank you for that question. For the first part, I think a lot of it, unless there's some penalty, I am concerned about, maybe in particular private landfills complying with any sort of benefit, community benefit agreement. Yeah, I'm basing that on the experience of the Orange County, of the Rogers Eubanks residents, and having, made agreements with the city in terms of what sorts of benefits they might experience as a result of being a host community. Of course, it's up to a community to decide, right? So I think there does have to be some transparency. And I do think that there has to be more monitoring, because we really just don't have a good understanding of, in particular with unlined landfills and construction and demolition landfills, I would argue that we really don't have a good understanding of, what the impacts on groundwater are. I would also argue that even lined landfills have the potential to leak. And that's not necessarily a surefire, protection. So just, at this point, sort of thinking through more innovative ways to reuse and reduce our waste stream are top priorities, in my opinion. I think the second part of that question was, around sort of more monitoring. Yes, check to that. Both more frequent monitoring, more monitoring of more contaminants, and monitoring beyond the boundaries of the landfill. So I think, there's, at least for the Sampson County landfill, there's no requirement to go much beyond the boundaries of the facility.
Next question is from Jordan Jack. Did photo voice participants mention PFAS specifically as a concern? do you think there's information circulating about this specific risk?
Great question. Residents actually didn't mention any compound in particular. They did raise concerns around water quality. We pursued PFAS based on our knowledge of what was going into the landfill, and we didn't, with qualitative approaches, you don't want to feed or lead residents. So we didn't, unless they were coming to the meeting with that information, we didn't try to shape what they were saying. So based on our understanding of what was there, and also in an attempt to understand whether that landfill was a source, for some of the novel PFAS, there's not going to be any other source for that nearby. So it was one of our ways to detect, to assess whether the landfill was a source of migration of leachate into the environment.
Thanks. We have a few more questions and a few more minutes. If you do have any final questions, please add them in the Q&A. This is from Michael Schachter. Along with traffic, there is materials coming off the trucks on the roadway and roadsides. Who is responsible for the cleanup of these? How often? I live on one of the roads leading to the Tuscarora landfill in Craven County.
Yes, that is also a great question. That I don't know that I know the answer to. There's certainly my experience, both in my own rural hometown, that we didn't host a landfill, but we had a sort of a site where we could go just up the street and dump stuff. And so there's a lot that's sometimes disposed of very close to the landfill. And I don't know if that's a sort of a Department of Transportation, because they're responsible for roads and adjacent to roads, or if that is the landfill's responsibility, if it's on their property. I think what I often see is that that folks put waste, they try to put it on the landfill's property with the hope that they will collect it and dispose of it.
Thank you. You're doing a great job jumping around on these questions at various points in the presentation. This one's from Adam Sochak. What do elected officials in Orange County say about the issues related to the Sampson County landfill?
I don't know that the question is, what did they say?
What do elected officials in Orange County say about the issues related to the Sampson County landfill?
I don't know that I've ever asked them. I don't know that residents here have asked them. I do think that, one of my main reasons for noting it is just that when we think we're resolving one issue, we may actually be exacerbating, or again, just sort of as Lisa Sorg noted, just moving the misery around. We're not, we're relieving one community of color, but basically dumping more on another one. I don't have a sense of what the local officials said. I would be interested to find out, though.
Yeah. We have one final question. Hi, Courtney. This is from Will Atwater. Did you say that there are 600 plus pre-regulatory landfills that don't have liners?
To my knowledge, yeah. The pre-regulatory designation is pre-RCRA, and so my guess is that folks who constructed those landfills weren't lining them out of the goodness of their hearts. So there are at least, I've seen some sources that say like 670. A list that I pulled down from DEQ was around 640. And there's the DEQ does have a program, pre-regulatory landfill program, where they're aiming to remediate and assess water quality and just better understand what some of the environmental impacts are of these sites. And they range in, again, size and proximity to residents and other sensitive receptors. So
I'm amazed that you succinctly and thoroughly answered all the questions that folks were adding. I do want to make sure you see, Courtney, that there is a great deal of appreciation for your research, for your partnership, for your teaching of us today and in general that's being lifted up in the chat. I know you're not looking at it right now, but you should look at it later. And for those who are still on with us, I invite you to fill out the Engagement Week evaluation to give us a little bit of feedback on this event and the series. We'll be sending out the recording of this session if there's somebody that you want to share it with afterward. And I'll just close with another round of appreciation, which you could see blowing up in the chat also if you would like to look at it. Thank you, Courtney, for your work and for being with us today.
thank you so much for the invitation.